welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hi, welcome to Syosset Library's Turn the Page podcast. I am your host, Jessica, and I am here with the author of a really awesome book. Definitely picks up on a lot of the things I like. Fairy tale retellings, a fabulous protagonist, all of these, sort of things that divert tropes and then blow your mind. And this book absolutely had it. So, Ry Herman, welcome to Turn the Page podcast. And let's talk about This Princess Kills Monsters.
Great. Happy to be here. Happy to talk.
Awesome. So, this is a retelling sort of a Grimm's fairy tale. Yeah, and it's not one of the ones that we generally see a lot of retellings of. It's the 12 Huntsman.
Yes. And of the approximately 300 people I have mentioned it to, two had heard of it before this, one of whom is a professor who studies fairy tales. So it's not unobscure, I'll put it that way.
I know I'd heard of it because, as I'd mentioned, I'm a huge fairy tale fan, but it wasn't one of the ones that really stuck out in my mind. And I do like some obscure ones, by the way. I was exposed to this really interesting, it was like an anime fairy tale show back, like that was on Nickelodeon when I was really young.
Oh,
And yeah, I think it was like, I can't remember exactly what it was called. I can picture the opening and the theme song, but it had some really obscure fairy tales, like The Tale of Brother and Sister, which I really liked, and other ones that were just super creepy. And then also the darker versions of like Snow White, where she gets strangled by the string in her bodice, and like not
they get pretty brutal.
yeah, they get really brutal, and I loved it. I thought it was amazing. So from that point on, I'm like, I really wanted to read a lot of the original Grimm's fairy tales, but this one, for some reason, I knew of it, but it did not stick out in my mind. So for you, when you started writing this particular story, how did it come to you as the main base for what you were going to build on?
It wasn't the story I started out intending to do a retelling of. I was looking through as many fairy tales as I could, and I looked through the major ones that have a lot of retellings, like Cinderella, like Snow White, the literary ones like the Snow Queen. But this one, when I came across it, and I had never heard of it before either, leapt out at me because it was so entirely bizarre. If I can give the briefest possible summary of the story. So a prince is engaged to a woman he loves, but his father, who is dying, summons him home, and his father says, I have one last wish before I die. And the prince says, anything. And the father says, don't marry that woman, marry this other woman. And the son is like, what? And then his father dies. So because he can't go against his father's last wish, he breaks up with his true love and becomes engaged to this other woman. And his true love decides that she will deal with this by finding 11 identical duplicates who look exactly like her in every respect, dressing them all up as men, and then going to work for this former prince, now king, who had broken up with her. He, of course, as is the way of fairy tales, does not recognize them at all and hires them on to be his huntsmen. At this point in the story, never having been mentioned before, the king's talking lion, who knows all manner of secret things, informs him that he has not hired 12 huntsmen, he's hired 12 women. And then the lion puts them through all sorts of bizarre tests to prove they're women, which they pass, and everyone thinks, well, looks like they're men after all. Then they go out hunting, and the king's new fiancée comes, and his true love promptly faints off her horse. The king goes to see what has happened to his beloved huntsman, pulls off her gloves, sees the ring he gave her, realizes this is his true love, and says, well, now I'm going to marry you, not that other woman after all. The end. And I read this and went, this makes no sense at all. Why did she find 11 identical duplicates? Which really served no purpose whatsoever in the story. Where did this lion come from? Why does this lion know they're women? Why does this lion care? How does the king not recognize his true love? All of these questions. And it also had a lot of queer subtext, which is something I adore, because when the huntsmen come to work for the king, his reaction is, wow, you are remarkably attractive men. I will hire you at once. But what I found myself most wondering is the princess, the one he's now engaged to, who comes in at the end and is then sent away. What does she think of all this nonsense? And so I ended up writing the book from her point of view.
I mean, for sure. And, I think from the standpoint of just somebody hearing the story like that from our age, I mean, I guess it depends on who you talk to, but, like my imagination would be that the princess should just be like, bye. Like, you guys have fun. Like, that's cool. Okay. I had no idea who you are. You clearly have a lot going on here, and that's fine. But I loved that this was the main character of this story. And, you gave a lot of depth to the stepsister trope and the stepmother trope. She has two stepsisters, or not really stepsisters. I'm sorry. One is a half sister, right?
Yes, one is a half sister, one is a stepsister.
Yes, yes. And they have varying degrees of magic, and Melilot, right? Is that how you pronounce her name? Um,
Yes, Melilot.
Melilot does not believe she does, but she and her sisters go off on all these adventures, hunting creatures that her stepmother sends them on, because her stepmother is apparently terrifying. And she stumbles into this story halfway because her stepmother's like, yeah, you know what, Melilot, you're gonna marry this guy. And she's just like, ah, okay. What are the cons to saying no to this? And this is where the story begins, where she meets the huntsman, and it was just so interesting. So just like the world around her and her stepsisters, or her half sister and stepsister's magic, did that kind of come before or after you sort of decided this is who the main character was going to be?
Definitely after. So I write books in all kinds of different ways. Sometimes I plot them out very carefully from the start. I have an outline, I know exactly where they're going. This one was much more, I'm going to start writing and see where it goes. The first chapter I actually wrote was the one where her stepmother is sending her off, saying, you must get married to this person you don't know, go, which is not at this point the first chapter in the book, because I found there were things in that I needed to fill in before getting to that point. But the world they inhabit was something that grew as I was writing. And what it became was, it's a very fairy tale world. What I found I wanted is a world where all the bizarre magic of fairy tales, which don't have easy explanations the way a lot of modern fantasy does, where things are very orderly and magic is a system. Things just happen. Things are bizarre. Creatures appear and disappear. People turn into lakes. People turn into birds. Why? Because they can. I
What?
wanted,
Yeah, no, that was the thing that really blew my mind the most. It was like, her sister's like, oh, she turned into a lake to impress somebody. And I'm like, how? How does that happen? You're just like, I want to show you how great I am. Here, I'm a lake now. Whoa.
well, that, well, that's straight out of another fairy tale. I ended up weaving lots and
Really?
lots of different fairy tales into this book. Yes. And there's a fairy tale of a type, I forget the exact name of the particular one I read, but it's a type called the Magic Flight. Fairy tales, folk tales are classed according to certain manners, where people are running away from someone who's trying to catch them. And they'll do things like, okay, well, I'll turn into a bird. And the person chasing them turns into a cougar. And I'll turn into a lake. There, catch us now. And so, yeah, that is something that just happens in fairy tales. So I decided that in the land Melilot, the main character, comes from, that's sort of the way of the world. That's the commonplace. That's how things go. You walk out, you meet a fox who tells you not to sleep at that inn, but to sleep at that other inn, and your life could be very different depending on whether you pay attention or not. And I also wanted to acknowledge how bizarre that is. So the land she ends up going to has a lot less magic floating around, a lot less this tradition. They're much more normal people to a certain extent. And when she says, "Oh, yeah, I would never do that because that'll make a curse happen," their response is, "What? What are you talking about?" And so I had the push and pull of both.
It was really cool. And it's so funny because when you're talking about the magic flight trope, it makes me think of Greek mythology with Apollo and Daphne. Although she did not turn, I don't think she turned herself into a tree. I think like she was, I think the goddess
She prayed for rescue,
yeah, she
yes.
prayed for rescue, and the goddess is like, "You're a tree now." And Apollo was like, "Well, now I'm going to wear part of you on my head. Good for you."
That's
Yeah.
something you're going to find a lot if you read Greek myths and you read this folk tales, that a lot of them are very clearly directly connected. And that as the culture changed, gods would turn into witches or fairies, but you can trace Beauty and the Beast straight back to Greek myths, many other stories. Cupid and Psyche
Yes,
is a story
is a
that's
beauty in the Yep.
yes,
Yeah.
extremely interesting if you've read these fairy tales. And the way fairy tales change and adjust themselves to society, the morals change, the characters change, is something that has always fascinated me. I really like that aspect of them.
And Cupid and Psyche and what is it? East of the Sun, West of the Moon are basically the same
Basically the
story
same story,
without
yes, absolutely.
gods.
As
So,
is
yeah.
Prince Hat Underground, which is another Scandinavian one.
Yeah, but this was really cool, and I really liked, how Melilot she's dropped into this story, and she has to sort of maneuver these huntsmen and sort of figure out, first of all, like this is the society that she comes from. It's matriarchal, it's ruled by her stepmother who's terrifying, and the society that she's going to, women don't really do much except for what women are traditionally supposed to do, which again just sort of like brings these two worlds against each other almost. And then you have the talking lion. So I liked that, you have Melilot kind of trying to figure out what exactly is going on with the huntsman and with this particular kingdom. But you also have the king of this kingdom just trying to figure out what's going on with her. In your mind, the more traditional kingdom, did that really come after you were building the world of where Melilot comes from?
That one was suggested to me by the story of the 12 Huntsman itself, because integral to that story is the idea of women dressing as men so they can do more. They wouldn't have been able to be hunters if they had come to the court dressed as women. So it's part of the story that this is a society in which women are consigned to certain roles. But it's also part of the story, and this is something I really like about the 12 Huntsmen, that that's nonsense. That when women are asked to prove themselves in a manly way, of course they can. It's not even difficult. The only reason that they're expected to stick to their role is because of these cultural pressures. So that always had to be a central part of the story. The idea that there's these pressures in this one kingdom, and having someone come from a place where that wasn't the case is one way to highlight that. And of course, the same thing goes, as I said, the queer subtext of the story very much becomes queer text in the book. And so I also looked at what does this very traditional medieval kingdom versus this very kingdom with a more modern, I'd say, attitude about gender, about orientation. What are the differences there? What are the changes that happen when they meet?
It worked out really nicely reading it. It was a very interesting, fun, and fresh read. I'm also just genuinely curious about your use of mini stories within the story. You have the overarching story and you have nods to other fairy tales and fairy tale tropes, but part of the story itself is storytelling and the characters telling each other versions of fairy tales. So, did you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yes, that was something I really enjoyed writing first. I loved writing the different versions of fairy tales and applying them to the backstory of the characters in the book so that one of the characters became a Rapunzel figure, other characters became part of a story called How Six Men Got On in the World. One reason I did that is because as I was writing this, as I was weaving all these stories in, it became in many ways a story about the stories we tell each other. What is real about them, what is fake about them, and what is valuable about them, whether they're real or fake. So it became important to have storytelling be a part of the story. It became another essential component to make the fact that the characters told stories to each other and that these stories can change and depending on who is telling them, depending on why they are telling them, depending on who they want to make look good and who they want to make look bad. As I said, the way folk tales and fairy tales change is something that's always fascinated me. And so that turned out to be a great way to get it in. And also, as it turned out, happily, a wonderful way to get some character backstory in there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think like an important thing to note is that, even though these stories are famously attributed to the Brothers Grimm, they all come from household stories that, mostly I believe women told each other and told their kids and vice versa. So, I mean, they're collections. The Grimm fairy tales are collections of household tales. And I think, like, sometimes when you're reading them, that's why you notice the similarities and you wonder if this was actually an earlier version of this. It's one of my favorite things just about reading those stories is
Absolutely. And
recognizing that.
you can see where two different stories got stuck together. You can see where two stories start the same and then go in different directions because of a cultural difference. And yes, they're very much collections. The Grimm brothers did do some editing, in part because of 19th century sensibilities. Some of the fairy tales had a lot more sex than they put in. Some had a lot more, I'm going to say, scatology than they put in. And they also, I discovered while I was researching this book, invented the evil stepmother because the stories they were told by these women, who they did not credit or acknowledge, which is a great pity, but we know who some of them are now at least, that was often mothers instead of stepmothers. Like for Hansel and Gretel or for Cinderella, in the original story, it was their mother doing all this. And the 19th century Grimm brothers said, mother wouldn't do that to a child. Let's make it a stepmother. Get that one step removed, a little bit of distance. So it made it a story more acceptable to them.
That is so fascinating. Wow. I mean, really, again, I don't want to give too much away because there is a lot of weaving tales which make this story what it is. But I will certainly say it was beautifully done, and I'm genuinely interested to see how people respond to it because I think it really was a very different and yet familiar take at the same time on fairy tales, which fairy tales are. I mean, that's really what it is. It's when you're like, oh, okay, I recognize this, but this is different. Are you a fan in general of retellings, and do you have any favorite, either movie or book?
Oh, I'm a huge fan of retellings. First, I'll say I'm a huge fan of fairy tales and folk tales in general. And while I get a lot of mileage in the book out of making fun of them, it's starting from a place of love. And I think a lot of the best satire starts from a place of love. I'm not mad at fairy tales. I just acknowledge how weird they are, and I love that. But fairy tale retellings, yeah, also something I love. One that always comes to mind is one by T. Kingfisher called The Raven and the Reindeer, which is a retelling of the Snow Queen. I love that one. That is really, it's beautiful. It's well told. She also has a more recent one, which is a very, very strange retelling of the Goose Girl called A Sorceress Comes to Call. And I love that one too. So let me think. What are some of the other retellings which I adore? Because I read a lot, honestly.
Yeah.
Oh, Melinda Lowe.
Oh, yes, 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 yes.
Melinda Lowe has some wonderful books like Ash and Huntress, which are retellings of fairy tales. They're great. I would highly recommend her too. As you can tell, I'm tending to lean towards queer retellings because I'm especially fond of those. I'm especially fond of the ones that play with the gendered expectations of the original stories. And as a queer author, I love the representation too. So those are some of the ones which are high on my list, and any others which occur to me. Oh, of course, Naomi Novik,
Yeah.
Spinning Silver, which is something of a retelling of Rumpelstiltskin. It gets very far from the original story, but at its base, Rumpelstiltskin is there. It's a beautiful book. And she also has Uprooted, which I'm not sure is a retelling of a specific fairy tale. It might be. If it is, I'm not sure which one, but very much is makes use of fairy tale tropes and is a fairy tale style of book.
I think that those are all really great. Are you going to do any other retellings, or are there any other just super strange fairy tales that you would like to tell people about before we sign off?
Both, as a matter of fact, because I have another book set in the same world, which will come out in about a year, featuring one of the extremely minor characters from this book, which is apparently something I love doing, because I found not a single fairy tale, but a set of them in which a woman falls in love with another woman or marries or becomes engaged to another woman in various ways, and then is magically turned into a man. And once again, this can go back to Greek myths because one of the earliest versions of that is Iphis and Dianthe. There's also there's a story from the East Caucasus region, which is also thousands and thousands of years old, called Alan Beg's Daughter, which has this plot. And I read this and I found like 24 different versions of these stories. And they're fascinating. And at first I went, ooh, a transpositive fairy tale, great. And there definitely are some that read that way. There are also a couple of Spanish versions which are very queer positive in terms of the characters live together as women for years before this transformation happened. So queer positive in all kinds of different ways. But as I was reading them, it struck me that the transformation into a man, it always happens at the end of this story. And it sometimes seemed forced on the story. Like it was saying, this is the only way the story could end. If it ends with a man and a woman, can't end any other way. We can't see that. And that made it seem less friendly to me, the same way that the 12 Huntsman is in some ways feminist and in some ways anti-feminist. There's this push and pull. So I wanted to know what would happen to a non-binary character in that situation. So I took a minor character from This Princess Kills Monsters, and who is quietly non-binary in the background of the story, and put them in the center of this story, which I decided to ultimately base primarily on one of these fairy tales called The Girl Who Changed into a Boy, which is a Romanian version of the fairy tale. And that fairy tale also gets incredibly wild, and it has talking magical horses and duels with giant creatures and all sorts of fun things. So I've tentatively titled that one This Night Topples Empires, and I guess keep an eye out for it.
Excellent. I'm looking forward to it. Thank you so much, Ry Herman. This was Jessica with Syosset Libraries Turn the Page podcast, and we are going to close this chapter.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.